This wasn't just an off-road vehicle, it was the primary workhorse of the armies of the Eastern Bloc. A machine that carried soldiers, radio operators, scouts, medics, and commanders from the Carpathians to Mongolia. In a world divided by the Iron Curtain, it had one simple mission: to keep moving no matter what. Snow, mud, sand, it didn't matter. There were no limits, only directions. Originally conceived as a military amphibious vehicle, it would eventually become a working standard in both military and civilian life. Today, you'll learn which world record the Uaz 469 managed to set, why it unexpectedly found buyers in Italy, and what allowed this old-timer to remain on the production line well into the 21st century. The predecessor of our story, the Gaz 69, was a classic body-on-frame off-roader, highly capable in rough terrain, but offering almost no comfort for the driver or passengers. Production began in 1952 at the Gorky automobile plant, but as the assembly lines there became overloaded, manufacturing was transferred to the Ulyanovsk plant, the one we now know as Uaz. For the military, which was the main customer, the Gaz 69 was more than adequate. Simple, relatively reliable, and able to go almost anywhere. Driver comfort was considered a secondary concern at best. A soft seat and a canvas roof? For the Army, that was already enough. But just 4 years after production of the 69 began, engineers in Ulyanovsk received a new technical assignment: to design a fundamentally different off-road vehicle for the military. And it wasn't meant to replace the Gaz 69. First, the 69 was still too new. Second, the assignment focused on a completely different concept: a military amphibious vehicle. According to the initial technical requirements, the new Soviet Jeep had to be amphibious, offer 400 millimeters of ground clearance to move through tank ruts, use fully independent suspension, and carry either 7 passengers or up to 800 kilograms of cargo. At the time, the Uaz Design Bureau was already busy working on the Uaz 450 family, the project that would eventually become the well-known Bukhanka. Even so, development of the new military vehicle began immediately. But almost as soon as the work started, the Ministry of Defense issued a major correction. The vehicle had to be capable of mounting a recoilless rifle, following the same approach used by the Americans and several Western European armies. There was only one problem. All those Western platforms were land-based. The Soviet design was being developed as an amphibious vehicle with a rear-mounted engine. If a recoilless rifle were installed, the backblast would strike directly into the engine compartment. For the Uaz engineering team, this effectively meant starting over. The powertrain had to be moved to the front. And that decision became the true starting point of what would eventually turn into the Uaz 469. Even more importantly, once the switch to a front engine layout was made, the Ministry of Defense dropped the amphibious requirement altogether, reclassifying the project as a conventional off-road military vehicle. And the idea of installing a recoilless rifle disappeared from the technical assignment just as suddenly as it had appeared. The requirements for the new vehicle remained demanding: independent suspension, 400 millimeters of ground clearance, seating for 7 or a payload of 800 kilograms, and a single unified body for both cargo and personnel. The biggest challenge was the ground clearance. The Gaz 69 had only 210 millimeters, and reaching nearly double that figure was impossible with conventional solutions. In 1960, Uaz built 2 prototypes. The Uaz 460 used the dependent suspension from the Bukhanka, while the Uaz 470 received an independent torsion suspension and portal hubs carried over from the earlier amphibious project. The military immediately favored the second design. Its performance off-road was remarkable, but issues soon emerged. The required clearance held only when the vehicle was unloaded. The new suspension demanded its own production line, and foreign experience wasn't reassuring either. Vehicles like the American Ford M151 struggled with stability, while the East German Sachsenring P3 suffered suspension failures during testing. After further discussions, the Ministry of Defense decided to take a step back and return to a traditional solid axle setup, keeping the portal hubs. Ride comfort had to be sacrificed, but the target clearance, ultimately reduced to a realistic 320 millimeters, was achieved. It was a compromise, but as history would show, a very successful one. In 1961, the first prototype of what would become the Uaz 469 was built. The vehicle used several components from the Bukanka, including its frame, the overhead valve 75 horsepower engine from the Gaz 21, and a 4-speed gearbox. The front axle was designed to be disconnectable, and the transfer case was integrated with the transmission, unlike the Gaz 69, where an external drive shaft between the units created much of the noise and vibration. New axles with internal reduction gears also appeared, and around this time the Uaz took on the shape we recognize today. At the same time, engineers developed a simplified civilian version, the Uaz 460B, intended for what was then called the national economy. It differed from the military model with a weaker engine from the Pobeda, no portal hubs, and no center differential. In everyday use, it drove in rear-wheel drive mode, with the front axle engaged only off-road. Later, the so-called military axles would become the hallmark of a true Uaz, and such vehicles would be valued far higher on the used market than civilian versions. But that would come much later. Mass production still had to be organized, and the road to the assembly line turned out to be a long one. Although both versions of the vehicle were ready by the mid-1960s, mass production kept getting pushed back year after year. There were plenty of reasons. At first, there simply weren't enough engines. The Ulyanovsk engine plant didn't start producing them until 1969, and the previous supplier couldn't deliver the required numbers. On top of that, the Soviet Ministry of Automotive Industry wasn't eager to fund the project. At the time, most resources were being funneled into building a new car plant, the one that would eventually become Lada. The Ministry of Defense wasn't in a hurry either. The Gaz 69 was still on the assembly line and continued to satisfy the Army's needs. As a result, full-scale production of the new Uaz only began at the end of 1972, almost 10 years after the first finished prototypes had appeared. The military version reached the assembly line a year later, in 1973, and accounted for only about 20% of the output. The remaining 80% were built for civilian and industrial use. Such a long delay on the way from the drawing board to the assembly line didn't harm the vehicle.